Hello my quilting friends! Leah Day here with a new video of the machine quilting party. Today we're quilting Jagged Plain, one of the coolest designs you can stitch with your walking foot. So this is a foundational design. You start with a nice zigzaggy line and expand it and echo it to create this cool effect. So let's jump on the machine. I'll show you all the steps to quilting Jagged Plain with walking foot style quilting. So I'm planning out my foundation for Jagged Plain. And this is a foundational design. What that means is whatever you stitch to begin with, that is what's going to be echoed repeatedly throughout your quilting space. So this can be a completely free-form line. The rule for Jagged Plain is simply straight lines and sharp angles. So I'm planning this out and actually marking it on the surface, and I'm created a very random, straight, zigzaggy line. Now, you might be wondering, how is this actually different from zigzag lines, a design we've already learned? Well, the difference is in how you think about it. And, texture-wise, they're pretty similar, especially if you stitch it kind of straight across your quilting space. And you might be feeling like that's not a very big difference. But trust me, when you go to quilt a real quilt with this design, it's gonna feel really different. And the main thing is in how you plan this foundation, how that zigzags through your quilting space. Definitely check out the Hugs and Kisses quilt. You'll see how I use Jagged Plain to fill in one of the X blocks. And that really was a very different effect than if I had stitched zigzag lines in that area instead. So now that I have my foundation planned, I'm going to just simply stitch along it. And I want these lines to be nice and straight. I want to try and avoid any curves in this design. So whenever I stop and pivot, I want to make sure that's a nice sharp direction change. And then to keep my straight line straight, a good tip is to kind of just keep your index finger of your hand parallel with the foot. This is a tip from free motion quilting, and it just helps you guide the whole quilt through the machine nice and straight, so you're not accidentally wobbling it or curving it without meaning to. Sometimes it's easy to do that. So keeping that index finger of your right hand running parallel just helps you to guide the whole thing through the machine. Now there are going to be a lot of direction changes, which can take some extra time. So this is going to be a design that I would use on a quilt that's special, where I want to take a little bit of extra time, put a little bit of extra energy into it. I want this specific texture on the quilt looking this way, and I'm willing to take that little bit of extra time in order to do it. And that's one of those things. Not all quilts deserve this level of quilting design. It takes more time and a lot more energy to quilt this kind of thing over an entire quilt, or even in a small section of a quilt. So whenever you're planning your designs, always be thinking about how much time and energy you have to invest in the project, because that's ultimately really what makes or breaks the project for you. If you pick a design and it ends up being too complicated or too time consuming, that's really going to affect how you enjoy the project. Okay, so now I'm right on the edge of my quilting space. I've lifted my needle and I want to space these lines a 1/2 inch apart. Now, you might be wondering, I've definitely kind of been doing 1/2 inch space lines quite a lot lately, and you might be wondering if that's just like what I always do, and it's not, but it is something that I use a lot because I really want you to see the texture. I want you to see what that dynamic design looks like on the surface of the quilt, and honestly, it is quite easy to space the lines because I can use the edge of the walking foot as a guide. Now, as far as these direction changes go, I'm just going to be eyeballing it. So I'm stitching up to it to where I think it looks like it's about a 1/2 inch apart, and then I rotate the quilt and just kind of guesstimate and see. So here I'm going to stitch beyond that line, what it looks to me to be about a 1/2 inch, rotate it around, and I was lucky. That ended up working out pretty good. Now, if I had overshot the line, then I could back up 1 stitch. If I had undershot the line, I would have rotated the quilt back and taken 1 more stitch and then rotated again. So you can see, a little time consuming. It's a little fiddly with these direction changes. I'm doing the same thing here. I'm stitching up to it to where visually I can just kind of eyeball that space between this line and my needle I'm going to eyeball that. That looks to me like about 1/2 of an inch. I'm going to rotate it and stitch on down. And this is not something to obsess about. Let's say I accidentally stitch the lines a little closer together through one little area. Is that going to break the quilt? Absolutely not. You know, if you stitch the designs ever so slightly irregular, that's not the end of the world. It's not going to make it ugly. If anything, it'll make it even more random and freeform and pretty. So don't feel like you have to stitch it perfectly. You know, we're using the edge of the walking foot as a guide. That's not going to be perfect. Sometimes the lines are going to come a little closer together. Sometimes they may be farther apart. Here I understitched, so I rotated back and I'm taking one extra stitch here. Now I'll lift the foot. I'm just lifting with my knee lifter here. That's a little bar, but I could also reach back here to the back of the machine and lift as well. So, you know, it's just a matter of looking at the lines, trying to get it nice and even. And if you do want a very specific look to your quilt, and if you want the lines to be absolutely dead on accurate, best option is to mark it. You know, marking really does ensure that the design is going to be absolutely perfect and exactly what you want. The downside is, again, it's more time consuming. Now I'm kind of lazy. If I wanted to stitch that next line going forward, I have to shove the whole quilt through the machine like this, and that's kind of a pain. So instead, I just line up the foot and hit the reverse button. So long as I stitch carefully, that usually works out pretty good. And then now I've backed up to 1/2 of an inch, so my needle is 1/2 of an inch from this first line. That looks pretty good. And now I can start my next line of echoing. So the foundational design, Jagged Plain, really just starts with that foundation. You plan and get that stitched. And then it's just a matter of travel stitching and echoing. The amount that you travel stitch or the distance that you put between the lines, that determines your quilting scale. Scale is the distance between your lines of quilting. And that's really going to determine how soft your quilt is, you know, how much quilting is there holding it all together. I will say softness really depends a lot on your batting and sometimes your backing too. This quilt is going to turn out super soft because I'm using Minky on the back, which is soft and squishy, and then a very puffy Quilter's Dream puff batting in the middle, which is super, super puffy. Unfortunately, it's also very linty, which is why I stop and lint roll my block off every once in a while because it's driving me nuts. I can't stand all this stuff flaking off everywhere. But you know what? It's totally worth it. I love how soft and cushy this makes the quilt. So don't feel like if you quilt it on a 1/2 inch scale that it's going to make the quilt stiff. This does not make the quilt stiff. It's the combination of quilting design plus whatever you're using on the inside that really is a combination that creates stiffness. So if I was quilting this even denser, let's say on a 1/4 inch scale, and let's say I used a batting that wasn't as soft and squishy and springy like a cotton batting, well, that would probably result in a pretty stiff quilt, you know? It's that combination and really figuring out what works and what's going to produce the look and feel of the quilt you want to make. That just takes time and practice. You know, you just got to keep quilting, try out a lot of different materials, keep notes, and then when you get a quilt that you really love the drape and feel of it on your bed and you know really want to just keep making that one, well then that's the kind of batting and that's the materials and that's the kind of quilting that you want to do on all of them, you know, and you don't have to guess and question it anymore. So I'm just going to continue travel stitching and echoing. As you can see, it's a little time consuming, it's a little slow, but you know what? The texture is totally worth it. I love Jagged Plain for adding that intense punch of texture, beautiful jagged lines over your quilts. And here's what it looks like when I finished quilting it. So that's it for this video. I really hope you enjoyed quilting this design with me today, but if you have any questions, be sure to ask in the comments below. I really want to help you master walking foot style quilting this year. It's such a fun form of quilting and it's very easy for beginning quilters to get started with because really the walking foot is doing most of the work for you. So definitely ask questions, share the video with your friends, and subscribe to our channel on YouTube so you don't miss the next video coming out soon. Now, if you like to stitch out squares and make the marvelous mosaic quilt you see behind me, you can find the pattern in my book, Explore Walking Foot Quilting with Leah Day. This book comes with 30 fun walking foot style quilting designs, as well as a wealth of information about the style of quilting and 7 fun projects for you to learn and stitch out with me. So definitely come and check it out at leahday.com/walkingfoot. And be looking for more videos stitching out new walking foot quilting designs every week. Until next time, let's go quilt!